Hey y'all, and welcome to Political. My name is Brian, and RFK Jr. isn't just going to make America healthy again. He gives one of the best answers on the nuances of the war in Ukraine that I have ever heard, and he shuts up Chris Cuomo. But before we dive in, I want to give a quick shout out to our great sponsors over at Colonial Metals Group. They quite literally have the cure to bite inflation, and though Trump won the election, you still need to protect your wealth as best you can, and that's what Colonial Metals Group can do for you. Now, let's dive in.
You think Trump would step away from Israel?
I don't think he's going to step away from Israel. Israel is in a defensive war. And Trump's policy on Israel has been much better in the past than the Democratic policy. So that's not going to happen. But, there's
Ukraine is in a defensive war also, but he hasn't been as sympathetic to that cause. That doesn't bother you at all, Bobby, that it seems to...
I don't consider Ukraine a defensive war.
Who started it?
I think that was a war. That was a war that was not. We're being told in this country that this is a war that is territorial. It's not. It's a war that was over security and that were legitimate. And I'm not excusing Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine. He had other choices, but he warned us. We tried to do something we shouldn't have done, which is to put NATO in Ukraine. And not only Putin, but every leader since 1992 of Russia has said that is going to be a red line. We went in 2014. We overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, and then we started the process of putting NATO in the country, which they said was a red line for 30 years.
Right, but Bobby, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how long
big...
somebody says it's a red line. You can't justify violence in a political situation. You don't like that NATO is going to be in Ukraine? Okay, you've been saying it for a long time. Okay, that doesn't make it okay if you go in and start a war and start killing innocent people for years on end. It sounds like you are doing exactly what you say you're not doing, which is justifying aggression.
No, I'm not. And I'm happy to talk to you about the history of this. In 2014, the aggression was coming from the Ukrainian government, which killed 14,000 ethnic Russians. And if that was happening in Mexico or Cuba, for example, if Cuba were putting U.S. missiles in Cuba, we would go in there. This happened in 1962. And my uncle's entire staff wanted to go into Cuba. He finally made an agreement with Premier Khrushchev at that time that we would remove our Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were on the Russian border, which they had a legitimate security concern about, and we did that. And then we signed two new intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia, and we walked away from those. And we said we're going to put Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland, which we moved NATO into those countries. We're going to do the same thing with Ukraine. If we did that, we'd be able to, in 4 minutes, decapitate the entire Russian leadership in the Kremlin. And that's something that we wouldn't tolerate that happening in Canada. We wouldn't tolerate it in Mexico, Cuba. We wouldn't tolerate the killing of 14,000 American expatriates in those countries. We would go in.
RFK Jr.'s right. And he gives an unusually perfect portrait of what's going on at a geopolitical scale. And he uses, of course, and he's going to use his own family's history as reference. So let's wind back the clock a little bit before we get back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and us putting the Jupiter missiles in Turkey back in the 60s. Let's talk about what happened in 2014 in Ukraine. Ukraine used to be is a part of the Near Abroad, which is basically all the nations that touch Russia, which just so happen to also be nations a part of the Soviet Union, with one exception, that's Mongolia. And these nations all used to be within Russia's sphere, except about half of them that are closer to the west. For instance, the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, these nations wanted to get away from Russia as soon as possible, and those nations are now known as the Baltic Tigers because their economies took off because, communism is stupid. Hey y'all, I'm not exactly looking at retirement anytime soon, but my parents are, and friends of my parents are, and I'm sure either you or someone you know is looking at retirement and wondering, what do I do? How do I help prepare for this in this economy with this terrible president and with a vice president who basically coup d'etat him and is now looking to run for president herself? How do you protect against this? Well, simple. You go over to my friends at Colonial Metals Group. They quite literally have something called the Retirement Package Plan. This plan backs your wealth with gold and silver accounts. And furthermore, you will have direct access to these accounts. So you're not at the whims of Wall Street. You're not at the whims of inflation. You are in command of your own destiny. As a bonus, qualified applicants can receive up to $10,000 in free silver, plus a couple of other little goodies that they're going to package up for you, and you're going to be able to protect your wealth and your retirement. So go over to this link in the description below at colonialmetalsgroup.com or call this number 800-203-0422 and see how they can help you prepare for retirement today by backing your account with gold and silver. Don't delay your retirement, folks. Protect the money that you earned with Colonial Metals Group. They're here to help. And then Romania left, and all of a sudden Romania started getting a whole lot better. My own mother has been to Romania on a couple of occasions, helping out some missionaries there. And she can give you some great stories about how that nation's worked. I've been to Poland, ironically enough, also in 2014. And their nation just keeps on getting better and better. They're basically the Texas of Europe, and I mean that in a quite literal way. So ultimately, what happened in 2014 in Ukraine, they found oil, the same kind of oil that you find out in North Dakota in the shale oil deposits. Ironically enough, that exact same area is where a huge portion of Ukrainians now live today. And they moved after the Holodomor, because Stalin was evil and so was communism. And so Ukraine has been in the Russian orbit because they share such a large border with them. And also Belarus, same problem. Huge ally to Russia. So they've been sort of caught between a rock and a hard place. But NATO has wanted to get into Ukraine ever since the Soviet Union came down. And that's been a red line for Russia. So they found oil in late 2013, and in 2014, magically, all of a sudden, there was a coup that the CIA orchestrated against a democratically elected government. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, the Ukrainian nation became very westernized. They became very close to NATO. And they broke up their nationalized oil company and then made a bunch of smaller ones in its place, because that's always the greatest possibility, shock therapy. Okay, so what happens next? Ultimately, Russia is threatened because NATO is now setting up bases on its border, and that mirrors a huge problem like in the early 1960s when JFK got this terrible piece of advice saying, hey, why don't you put some Jupiter nuclear missiles on the Turkish border? That way you can nuke Russia in a matter of minutes. Yeah, great idea. That's not going to take one of the most paranoid nations on the face of this planet and make them do smart things now, would it? That, of course, caused them to go into Cuba, which, by the way, we botched because JFK wouldn't get off his butt and actually do the right thing and invade Cuba and take Castro out. But that's my spicy historical take. Anyways, Russia then set up missiles in Cuba, and that creates a Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we're basically with our thumb on the nuclear button. And fortunately, we're able to de-escalate. And we removed our missiles from Turkey. They removed their missiles from Cuba. And relationships were kind of icy after that. And so Russia is threatened by a similar problem today. And RFK Jr. specifically mentioned this with the Aegis missiles. And that can strike the Kremlin within a matter of minutes. And so, again, like I said, you can always trust Russia to be paranoid. And that's because of their vast history. Seriously, look into the history of Russia. It's nothing but suffering. And so you are now threatened by Ukraine, and you just saw a lot of ethnic Russians basically get brutalized and murdered by the Ukrainian government. Okay, so you're a paranoid nation, you have NATO on your doorstep, and you just watch your native people get slaughtered. Yeah, I can understand where Russia is coming from. So again, this is not an excuse for Russian aggression. But you don't understand someone until you step in their shoes and walk around for them in a bit. That's the whole point of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. That's exactly what RFK Jr. is doing here, and that's why I understand where he's coming from. And ultimately, I want to end with this. While Chris Cuomo is asking some very important questions, he is starting to understand that he needs to let his guests talk, particularly his more controversial ones. Like, for instance, the conservative ones. When he was back on CNN, he would interrupt ad nauseum. And he's ultimately realizing that that's what it takes to be a real journalist. And so, to allow someone to have their say, to speak their piece, and then talk about the issue afterwards, that's what changes you from a show host to an actual interviewer. So I'm starting to really respect Chris Cuomo, and RFK Jr. just continues to show time and time again that he actually knows what he's talking about, and the mainstream media wants to deflect from that because he's outside their orbit, and therefore he threatens them. And that's why I love RFK Jr., and I'm really starting to respect Chris Cuomo for doing finally what he's supposed to do as a journalist. I guess that's what happens when you leave CNN, although Don Lemon's the counterexample to that. Bless his heart. Folks, my name is Brian. Hope you enjoyed that segment here on Politibrawl. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you on the next one, and until then, y'all have a good one.